Welcome to the Beer Temple, very special episode on location at Owen and Engine. I am here with my friend Steve Hamburg, and we're here to talk about real ale.
Steve?
Yeah, so basically, real ale is the, well, Steve, why should I talk about what real ale is when we have you here?
Do you want the dictionary definition?
I want your definition.
Real ale is basically any beer that completes its fermentation in the vessel that it's served from. So traditionally that is in a cask, but it can be real ale in a bottle. So if you have a bottle conditioned beer, you still have yeast there, and that means that the beer is continuing to undergo its secondary fermentation in that container. It's real ale. So you can have real ale in a bottle.
Okay. And what about cask ale then? Cask ale is a style of real ale?
The cask is the container. So just as you have a bottle that has yeast that's still working, then the cask is your container. And it makes it easier if you're working in a pub, so you're going to serve larger quantities of draft beer through it. And they come in different sizes. So
what's the point of having cask ale? What's different from just regular beer?
Well, there are a lot of things. For many people would tell you that it is a load of rubbish. That it is an old-fashioned way of serving beer, and it has so many issues to it that it's not worth the effort.
Okay.
I think when it's done right, if you've handled cask ale properly, then the flavors, the aromas that you get out of the beers, and the condition and the mouthfeel that you get out of those beers is just different than having a beer that's bottled or served out of normal keg. And when you get that, when you get the beer at its perfect sort of peak of perfection, there's nothing like a cask ale.
Well, you kind of alluded to something, a peak of perfection. A lot of people who have bottled real ale, let's say, which is quite a few craft beers now are, just unpasteurized and unfiltered in the bottle, or just kegged beer. They don't really think of a beer as changing, developing, or maturing, but that really is very much the case with real ale, where it is undergoing changes, and there's really kind of a finite time when you can drink it, or
and it really depends. I mean, there's a tendency to think that real ale is a style of beer. It's not. It's a form of dispense. So let's be really clear about that.
Yeah.
So real ale isn't. Any beer can be real. In fact, I prefer not to call them real ales, but real beers. And it's interesting because
it could be lager.
It could be lager.
Got it.
The complexity that we're getting in the cask process is that the beer is still working, and that to get the beer out of the cask, because we're not pushing it out, you're going to pull it through a beer engine. To pull that out and also maintain the right level of carbonation in the beer takes a few extra steps. And that's where the cellerman comes in.
Okay.
So the keys in cellaring are, is you get your delivery of a cask, make sure it sort of gets to cellar temperature, because it's going to come in, it may be on a truck, it may be bouncing around, let that beer settle. You go to your cellar and you stillage the beer. And stillaging is simply the term of you position your cask in the position it's going to be served from.
Got it.
Now, which
is on its side, typically, right?
It doesn't have to be.
Okay.
There are devices that you can use through the keystone, through the tap amp.
Right.
And you can extract beer through that.
But typically, and here at Owen and Engine, they do serve them on their side.
Yes. And what you do is you would lay it on its side. And typically you want that beer to settle on its side. And then you actually breach the cask by poking a peg through one of the bung holes.
Which we watched Elliot do, and we'll be showing some footage of Elliot doing it.
And what that does is it releases any built up CO2 that's in the beer until a new equilibrium is built in the cask. So as soon as you breach that cask, it's like opening a can or a bottle. Beer, carbonation comes out of suspension, and you get a little foaming. So a lot may start fobbing out, and then another equilibrium is reached in the beer. And what you want to do in the cask is get that sort of optimal level of carbonation and then seal it.
And how can someone determine when they've reached the optimal level of carbonation?
Well, there are all sorts of tricks.
Okay.
So some do it on time.
Okay.
I'd use a soft spile and monitor carbonation through the soft spile. See, now you can use a wooden hard spile because the wooden spiles are still slightly porous.
Got it.
So there you can spile initially with a hard spile, and condition will seep through, but there you would give it hours. If you're using a soft spile, oftentimes beer will fob through the soft spile almost immediately. One of the
Foam on beer is fob.
Yeah.
Yes.
But it's all, they just say it's fobbing. So it foams out right through the porous spile. It's made of bamboo. And it can make a mess.
Yeah.
So there are devices you can get that you can substitute for that spile. You can actually put a metal or plastic device that's tied to a tube so that the foam runs
back.
No, not filters back. It rather than making a mess in your cellar.
Got it.
That you run it into a bucket or a glass.
And so you're talking a lot about foam, optimal carbonation, temperature is also important. Can you talk a little bit about the, I guess the belief or the saying that English like their beer warm and flat? And they're referring to
cask
beer at the time. Is that, would you say, an accurate description of
I always tell people who haven't been to the UK for the first time and they're interested in having traditional beers, is that that traditional beer is cooler, meaning warmer than American, so it's cool and less carbonated. So warm and flat is the simplification.
Okay.
We still deal with it because I know people from Germany, they go there, they go, oh, everything here is warm and flat. And Americans who go and they're used to everything being 38 degrees Fahrenheit or lower.
Okay.
And with tons of carbonation in the beer. And then they go to England and they get a pint and they go, well, this is warm and flat. Well, optimally, a cask beer is going to be about 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit.
Okay, so cellar temperature.
Cellar temperature. And what I usually tell people is, you ever go outside on a 50-degree day in a t-shirt?
Right.
Well, that's room temperature.
Yeah.
Okay, you don't go out, it's 50 degrees, you're probably going to have a jacket on.
Yeah.
So that's not ice cold, but it's cool enough to wear a jacket or sweater.
Absolutely.
So it should be cool. So that is the key. And then the other thing is that the carbonation level is not as high. In many American beers, it's common to have over 3 volumes of CO2 in that beer.
Right.
Sometimes higher. Certain beers, Weiss beer, certain Belgian ales are particularly spritzy. English ales, they target 1
Yeah, they're
volume.
much on the
But I prefer kind of 1.5, 1.6 if I'm doing them myself.
I'm more of a 1.65 guy myself.
There you go. Yeah. I think it's better part of it is I think it's better, particularly in this market, if you're going to serve real ale. It's better to err on the side of when you're sending the beer out, trying to maximize whatever natural carbonation you have, because in the process of serving it, you're going to lose some carbonation.
Sure.
So while the beer is on, it's going to lose its carbonation. So if you started with 1 volume of CO2, by the time you're done with a cask, it's going to get really flat.
Right.
So I'd rather start higher, have it lose, so that when you finish, it's at about 1.
It's interesting. I mean, it really brings to light that beer is perishable, especially with cask, because it's exposed to, potentially oxygen, often oxygen, and that's going to affect the beer. It's going to give it a very short lifespan. I think Elliot said 4 to 5 days is what they try to move through their beers with.
And what they're doing here is they're using a cask breather, which is almost essential if you're going to do cask beer in this country. Which technically, according to
the English rule, is a no-no, but it seems not realistic.
Campaign for Real Ale, there are those. The official position is that you don't use a breather, but that is not universally admired.
Agreed. Yeah.
People have done blind tastings. The idea is that people say you shouldn't use a breather because you're adding additional carbonation and that gets absorbed, and that the beer will change and it picks up additional carbonation.
So real quick, for people who don't know what a breather is, so a breather is basically something that blankets the
The beer.
the space in the empty space in the cask with low pressure CO2. So it's not forcing any beer out, but it's also not allowing oxygen to interact with the beer and spoil it faster.
Well, what a cask breather is also known as a demand valve. So basically, what happens is in normal traditional cask dispense. So if you hook up a pump to your cask, basically the spile hole is left open.
Okay.
And so when you pull,
And the spile hole is just a hole in the top of the
just a hole,
just a hole in the
small
top.
small hole.
Yep.
When you're pulling, as beer gets pulled up, external air gets pulled in, gets sucked in.
Sure.
So you're oxidizing that beer right away. And you start by the surface area, and so if the cask is full, there's not a lot of surface area.
Right.
But as it gradually starts lowering, you get more and more
Expands,
surface of the beer that is exposed to oxygen. So in traditional dispense in a pub, if you're in Britain, they would rarely go more than a day on one cask.
Just because of the demand.
Demand is going to, certainly you'd hope that the demand would empty that in a day. But the beer will change. And that used to be one of the characters that people really liked, is they said, oh, I kind of like it the second day because it starts to oxidize and you get different flavors and aromas.
They refer to it as being on, right?
Yeah, well, what I would say is, if you're a brewer, who the hell do you want screwing around with your beer? You brew a beer to be a certain way.
Right.
And, who's to say my beer is best when it's 2 days versus 3 days or 1 day?
Right.
Most beers are at their best when they leave the brewery. Now, granted, these are finishing in the cask. But normally, I think they're best when they're at their liveliest and freshest.
And we're lucky that there are places in cities like Chicago that kind of specialize in cask ale, like Owen and Engine. And speaking of which, we've been talking a lot about it. The kind of elephant on the bar, if you ask me, is this really beautiful beer right here. This is the Arcadia Double IPA. Is that what we're drinking?
Hop mouth.
Hop mouth. And you're right. I mean, it certainly is brilliantly clear. Really lovely looking beer. And there is a little carbonation. I mean, certainly not kind of foaming up.
One of the things when you're, as you drink, you'll notice also because of the temperature, because we're talking about warmer temperatures than normal draft dispense, you get the aromas of the beer, the yeast aromas, the hop aromas really are more to the fore. So there's a fruit character.
Absolutely. Very fruity. Kind of
very like plummy.
I was going to say fresh plums. That's what was coming to mind. It's really kind of black cherry, fresh plum, and really lovely.
When the same beer is had and it's very cold, you're not going to get a lot of that flavor out of it until the beer warms up. Now there's a lot of hop in this, but you get less of that hop that we're used to in the aroma, but you still get a lot of the hop flavor.
Yeah, plenty of hop flavor. You're getting a lot of that kind of herbal. I mean, maybe I'm just thinking because it's an English dispense, but it does remind me of kind of the English style hops, kind of the earthy herbal.
But again, notice as we're drinking, I mean, we're still seeing there's lace in the glass, and as you swirl, we continue to get carbonation out.
Absolutely.
So this is not flat.
No.
It's just not. It's not as gassy as you'd be used to.
Not nearly. I mean, it does taste nearly flat.
And the other thing
by
is,
American standards,
what I kind of like about having cask ale is they're not as filling, because there's a tendency to get really bloated on a lot of very highly conditioned beers.
Yeah.
And so imagine this beer that is fairly strong anyway, and don't do this at home, or don't expect to see this in a pint when you go out, because it's a fairly strong beer.
It's okay. We're
for demonstration purposes only.
Yeah, do not try this at home. You do get the booze. You can get some booze in here. You get some warming in the beer. Really kind of a lovely beer, and it's, I guess, fitting that it's an Americanized version of a traditional English ale.
Too often what happens, and it happens in the UK as much as it does here, is that we forget about maturity. That beer can mature. There's no rule that says when a beer comes into your bar, that you got to put it on right away and serve it right away.
Right.
And usually the best thing to do with cask ale is to wait. It gets better. So many times I've been at places in Chicago that do cask ale, and a lot of places when I have it, I go, you just put this on, it just came in. And they look at me and they go, yeah.
Right.
How do you know that? I said, because I know this beer. and this beer tastes better if it had been given time to settle and you served it on cask. It's going to be brighter. But it's not going to show these signs that it's been shaken around. So sometimes just time and temperature will allow a beer to drop. Now they use, traditionally you would use finings in beer.
Yeah.
Now you don't have to fine beer.
Fish guts, right?
Yeah. And one of the reasons a lot of people don't use finings is the traditional deal is isinglass, which is from swim bladders of sturgeons.
Yeah.
Well, it means that the beer's not vegan.
Right.
Well, you don't have to do that. And a lot of it is if you use a really good flocculent yeast and you give beer time and proper temperature, all those proteins, that yeast is going to settle, and you're going to have a bright and clear beer. It's a question of time. But again, part of what the cellaring process does is that what Elliot has done here in his cellar is he's given the beer enough time and he's handled things well enough that he's put this beer on where it's bright and clear.
Yeah.
And if you took the same cask and threw it up on the bar, fresh after delivery, whacked the tap in it and started pouring it, it's not going to look like this.
No, and I've seen, they can be really kind of unsightly if you don't let them.
And it may taste good.
Sure.
And again, chacun à son goût. I love throwing the French in there. To everyone, your own taste, I guess.
Okay.
But
whatever floats your boat.
There you go. I think there's something about having a beer in a glass that's beautiful. And I think people like beer. One of the reasons beer has gotten lighter in color, hundreds of years, is that it's served in a glass.
Yeah, there's glass now, so it matters what it looks like.
It matters what it looks like.
Yeah.
And people would look at it and say, ooh, they'd look at this and say, think about how many Americans would say, well, that's a dark beer.
Absolutely, yeah.
And yet it's really not a dark beer.
No.
It's bright and clear, it's amber colored, but it's not dark at all.
No, it's actually quite beautiful. So I think we're going to talk with Elliot a little bit about what they do specifically here at Owen Engine. So talk me through from the time the delivery truck comes or however you get your firkin and it drops it off at your front door till the point where it was drawn that we just did some video of. Just walk me through that process a little bit. And how it differs from what you would do with a keg of beer.
Typically, I get my deliveries on Thursday, and while I try to be here for the delivery, I can't always be here. And when the delivery drivers unfortunately handle the cask beer just like a regular keg and bounce them down the stairs, which shakes it up and really causes detriment to the condition of the firkin. And so it is absolutely necessary for the cask beer that I rest it for at least 3 days, if not longer, just because in order for all the sediment that is now all shaken up, it will not drop, it'll leave the beer cloudy if I tap it right away. Versus a keg, I mean that comes in and it still bounces down the stairs on the hand truck just like the rest of it, but it sits in the cooler for 24 hours, hits the right temperature, and it's a party. I'm ready to go. The keg room, I can set them on the rack and get them ready to go right away, and just wait to tap them. But with the firkins, it really takes a lot more time and a lot more effort. There are some times that I run out of something and I get somebody that gets a little angry because they want to know when the next firkin's being tapped, and I have to explain to them, well, and unfortunately, firkins don't work like regular kegs, so it's going to be about 7-8 hours before the next one's ready to tap, unfortunately. But it is what it is.
So then it's ready to be tapped. So it's now settled. It's sat for a couple days.
It's sat for a couple days. It's sat for a couple days on a side rack. When I get a open spot in the stillage, I'll lift it up into place in the stillage as carefully as possible and spile it. Spile it meaning puncturing puncturing the shy with a little wooden peg to vent it off. which excites all the particulate in the bottom of the firkins again. Let that settle out while everything's degassing. And then within 7-8 hours, run down, take the spigot, knock it through the keystone, and hook the hose up to the front, open it up, and then we're ready to go. Pull the rest of the water that I've had running through the line to rinse the line out, and it's a party.
Cool. Awesome. And now I've heard some... Do you use sparklers here? I guess
No, I don't use sparklers. Sparklers are neat.
And what are sparklers?
Sparklers are little attachments that you screw onto the end of your goosenecks of your beer engines that actually knock out carbonation when you pull it to leave a visible head on top of the beer. I don't like to use them because I like to make sure that there's carbonation still in the beer. Like if you use a sparkler, you get a very pretty beer, but a very flat beer. If you don't use a sparkler, you can they're potentially less pretty as it gets poured because you don't have that residual head all the time sitting on top. But at least you still do have some decent amount of carbonation left in the beer itself.
And what do you yourself find appealing about cask ale versus just any other type of beer?
I really appreciate the depth of flavor that I can get out of it, and that I can drink more of it because it doesn't fill me up. But the depth of flavor is just outstanding. Biggest example I can give is Cain and Abel from Two Brothers. By itself, Cain and Abel is a pretty good beer. It's a great, hoppy, relatively strong rye ale. So it's about 7%, finished with Thai palm sugar and a good load of American hops. And it's a very good beer by itself. But on Firkin, you taste the Thai palm sugar. You taste the rye so much better. You taste every little bit of malt complexity and every little bit of hop complexity, and 90% of the time the firkins that I get have more hops or other interesting ingredients added to the firkin themselves, which adds just a whole another layer of complexity to the finished product. So the Cain and Abel on cask is one of my favorite beers, period. It's good out of the bottle or on draft, but on cask it is beautiful.
One thing we hadn't touched on, and I forgot about, if you could just briefly talk about the difference from the brewery side, you can't just send a keg to a bar and make it into a real ale. What does the brewer have to do to present real ale?
The best thing to do, and a lot of guys do, is they run their beer through normal fermentation. Mm-hmm. But instead of when they're transferring for keg, what you do is you can transfer to cask without filtering your yeast out. So there's still some yeast in suspension of that beer. And then I would prime the beer using a sugared solution, just like homebrewers would do.
So prime means to add sugar, additional sugar that the yeast can then use to make some alcohol, but really it's for carbonation.
It's for carbonation.
Yeah, so it is to add pressure.
It's just like bottle conditioning.
Correct. Yeah.
And you could use some active yeast, like krausening.
Right.
So some will take a bit of krausen and throw some of that into their kegs.
And krausen is still fermenting beer, young beer.
Small amounts of young fermenting beer. So again, once it's sealed, you have something that's fermenting, and it restarts that fermentation in the cask, and it's going to complete there.
Great.
And it's going to complete in the.
That's cool. I mean, that's really what I love about real ale, is how it's a living creature, how it's constantly changing, and how there's an art form to it.
Yeah.
To getting, it doesn't just come like this.
And when you get it right, it's just a beautiful thing.
It really is. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been very educational for me, and I'm sure it is for the viewers as well.
My pleasure. First location shooting.
Yeah, absolutely. So
cheers.
Cheers. Until next time, we've got some great real ale to drink, and hopefully you do too.